So we're talking about how belonging group you belong to is going to affect your beliefs. So if you in the group you belong to is going to affect your thoughts, emotions, and everything. If you grow up poor, you belong to a impoverished group. That's going to affect your biology. It affects the way that the neurons wire in your brain. And actually, they have people who grow up in poverty. They have lower IQs. And the conservative mentality, which would be more often adopted by white people because that's what serves their group because they were the victim. They were the oppressors. They were the top. They were at the top, and they want to justify their position, and that's natural. And they want to say that they weren't bad and that what they did was good and everything. So they're more inclined to the conservative position, and then looking down on the victims, blaming the victims. But what they'll do is they'll say, no, the reason why we're richer is because we have higher IQs, and that's why we're richer. But then a more liberal person will say, well, these people have lower IQs because they're poorer, and it has epigenetic effects, and there's a lot of different variables and stuff. But anyways, these are different based upon the group you belong to is going to affect your beliefs. So let me just explain some more intricacies of the quadrant example. So like thinking is the first quadrant of the third quadrant. Well, your thoughts are actually affected by the first quadrant, your sensations, and your perceptions, and vice versa. So first quadrant and third quadrant, they're interacting. And what I mean by this is, check this out. There's studies called the superior warfare hypothesis, and what they say is that, or there's a theory called the superior warfare hypothesis, and it says that the language that you use affects the way that you sense and perceive reality. So one language would be like the Hopi language, where they would see time differently. Their language had a different it had words for time that were more in relation to circular time and not linear Newtonian time. And then the way that they perceived reality, they according to this hypothesis, they perceived reality differently in this different type of time. And so your language is going to affect the way that you perceive it. And even the Greeks, like the ancient Greeks and ancient people throughout the world, they had only a few terms for color, and they actually only perceived only a few colors. So language is your thoughts. So you think through language, and your vocabulary, your currency of language is going to shape your perceptions. Also, your perceptions affect your language, but they both kind of go back and forth, and they interact with each other. And then like for instance, when the Europeans went to certain tribes, they would introduce to these tribes the other colors, and then the tribes would start seeing the other colors, because you only see what your language allows you to. And then the same thing with like mathematics. People say mathematics is language. So a physicist with his mathematical language is able to perceive things that other people aren't able to perceive. When he looks at the rainbow, he's seeing something different. He's seeing the particles, and through his mathematical understanding, he can see actually there's a third and fourth order rainbow right there, because he has a mathematical understanding. His language is different. Now his thinking is different. Now he can actually perceive differently. He has more awareness, first quadrant awareness. And that's affected by his language, which is the third quadrant, thinking. But in terms of like, so a liberal idea would be, the more conservative idea would be, yes, the conservatives say that the people on top, they deserve it, and that tends to be, they tend to look up to white people because white people colonize other people, and the conservative mentality is that I don't want to use the word victimizer because it has a valence that is kind of negative, but the dominant group, the dominator, is the good guy. That's a conservative mindset. So what they're gonna say is they look really highly upon white people. So they want to say, well, white people are smarter, white people are better, less sinful and stuff. But then the liberal mindset, they're gonna say, okay, let's look at environment. Well, one is they're going to look down upon the white person, but a very liberal, more of a transpersonal liberal perspective would be, let's not look at genetics or anything innate or inherent in people. Let's look at the environment and stuff. So, but a liberal person is going to say, like, first off, like the Greeks, like a conservative person is going to be more likely to say, yeah, the white people were dominant. They had the Greeks. The Greek people, they were the philosophers. But a more liberal person is going to say, well, they weren't really white people, those Greeks. Actually, a lot of the philosophers that the people look up to are actually Ionians, and that's more in the Middle East. So these people weren't really white, and a lot of these Middle Eastern people actually looked down upon the white people. They saw them as inferior. So again, what group you belong to is going to shape how you perceive reality, how you're going to your belief system. It's going to shape all these things. So, but another like transpersonal liberal perspective would be, people would say, oh, the Romans, they dominated because they were superior. They had better genes. They were Indo-Europeans, and that's why they were able to make this huge empire, because they're smartest. They're the smartest. And I remember I was listening to a black woman talking about that. She was like, yeah, you got to give respect to the Romans, man. They really did, they really did, conquer the world. That's really amazing. But that's that looking highly upon the dominant group. And then maybe she's trying to look at inherent biological qualities that gave them that power, and she's like, oh wow, they're amazing. But a more transpersonal liberal perspective, they're going to say, well, why were they able to? And let's not look at the genes or intelligence or something like that, or even like a liberal. Some liberals might say, oh, well, the reason why they conquered is because they were the devil. Like that's the Black Hebrew Israelites interpretation. They say that Esau's the devil, and Esau was the Romans and the Indo-Europeans, and there's some validity to that, and that the Hittites, the Edomites were descendants of Hittites, and they were Esau and the Indo-Europeans. So there might be some validity to that idea, but to the fact that Indo-Europeans did colonize Israel and stuff, and they were often depicted as the bad guys in the Bible. But again, a transpersonal liberal perspective is going to say, okay, let's not label anybody. We can't do anything about genes. We can't do anything about that stuff. But what we can do is we can work on our mentality. We can not put people down like Tommy Lauren. Tommy Lauren, she's a conservative, and what she does is, she makes good points. Working hard is important. That's important. But the way that she does it with the attitude and the condescension, where she says, "Oh, we work hard, and you guys live in your basement," and she has the tone, and that attitudinal tone, and the condescending attitude, and also that kind of prejudicial implications that she's trying to subtly, she's trying to imply that black people don't work hard and stuff, or people of color, and that's why they're not as rich and stuff. And she has that condescending attitude, and that's a judgmental attitude. So, and that's what the problem is. That's that air of superiority, that ego, conceitedness, self preoccupation, arrogance, and that's not the flow. The flow would be when you lose yourself, right, and you're just working hard at whatever you're doing. But so Ayn Rand has a point. Working hard is good, yeah. But the problem is when people start to take credit for what they do and start abusing the lower people, and especially when there is environmental factors. For instance, it's a fact that black people or people of color have been discriminated against, have been mistreated, taken from Africa, and abused and exploited. And you have to take this stuff into consideration, and this is an aspect of reality that you have to understand if you want to deal with reality in the most effective manner, in the most transparent. You have to look at things transparently. So not everything is so black and white as the conservatives want to make it seem. But my point was so a transpersonal liberal perspective, when they're looking at the Romans, are going to say, well, why did they take over most of the world? Well, it's because they were in an environmental geographic area in the peninsula that was in the Mediterranean Sea that allowed them to take power of the trade routes in the Mediterranean. And this is a very strategic spot, very, very consequential to have this area of land. And by having that area, they were able to dominate. And the other group that vied with them for power was the Carthaginians, and they also were on that in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, where they could control the trade routes. And you saw the conflict between them. Now, a person who people might want to look at genetic Darwinian and say, okay, well, the Carthaginians, they were Semites, and this is kind of the way Freud looked at it. And Freud didn't look so highly upon the Europeans, and he saw himself more as a Semite in like the Carthaginians, and so he looked really highly upon Hannibal, who tried to conquer the Romans. but the Carthaginians ended up being destroyed by the Romans. And then you could say, oh, that's because people of color they're dumber, and that's why the Romans beat them, and that's a conservative mentality. But a liberal mentality is going to say, okay, why did this happen the way it did? Well, it's a fact that people from northern latitudes they have colder climates, and this forces them to be more um, like orderly. I'm trying to think of the good word. It starts with C, like economical, um, like thrifty. Because when you're in a colder climate, you have to. There's less of an opportunity to make mistakes. You can die. But the people in the warmer climates, they have there's more of a relaxed type of vibe, and you even see that like in the South in America where people talk differently. And remember, thinking is they talk with a drawl, and it's kind of a elongated and kind of relaxed, and that's because the warmer climate affects the way you think, and it affects the way you behave. So sensation perception response awareness. Their sensations perception. They're in an environment that is more conducive to that mode of being. And it's been a fact that every single war in history where a northern group has fought a southern group has always the northern group always wins. The group that's higher up in the latitudes always win every single war. You've seen that throughout history. Never been a case where that hasn't happened. So that's the way you look at it geographically, the way that things work. Um, and that would be more of a liberal perspective. Let's not say that Indo-Europeans were superior to the Semites. It has to do more with geography and how geography affects your society, where the Indo-Europeans were forced to do more agricultural stuff and invent more things because of their climate, and it also their climate allowed them to the Northwest Axis, and this gives an advantage when you're dealing with the more southern people who didn't have as many environmental factors, those impetus, the impetus that the northern people had. Um, and then like I want to say too, I remember I was listening to this one lecture where this professor was talking about there was this guy who went to the African tribes. So people say, oh yeah, the Indo-Europeans, the Greeks, they were the smartest. They had Shakespeare and stuff. Like Britons had Shakespeare. The Europeans are smarter. That's a conservative mentality. But then there was this guy who traveled to study African tribes, and he got initiated into one of the tribes, and the tribal leader told him their philosophies and which were basically secret. You had to be initiated to get it. And this guy, this anthropologist, described that their teachings were at the caliber of Plato, if not higher than Plato. He said it just like blew his mind, but he wasn't allowed to like write it down or anything. He just had to listen. But he said that the teachings were just unfathomable. So, but the thing was, the difference between the like the African people in the tribal societies and the Europeans was the Europeans had writing system. They got to write it down. It's not because they're smarter. It's because they had the agricultural system, which allowed for more free time to do that. And different and they had agriculture not because they were smarter, but because of the East-West axis. This is a liberal viewpoint. This is Jared Diamond's viewpoint. But the Africans, they had an oral culture that, according to this anthropologist, was just as advanced, if not at a higher caliber. Um, so the liberal perspective is going to look at it that way, and it's not going to try to put down anybody and try to justify mistreatment of people and an arrogance and self-conceited approach to reality that is a fixed mindset. And that doesn't really accomplish that's not very harmonious type of way of being, and it's not accurate to reality in most cases. Um, And I want to say too, a lot of people, one interesting phenomena is the phenomena where people will look down upon black people for hitting on women a lot. And they'll, but then if you look at the African tribal societies, they had their women were allowed to be naked, and a liberal perspective is that it should be okay for women to be naked. If you have an advanced enough consciousness and not a predatory consciousness, a woman showing her breasts is not a big deal. That happened in Africa, in American Indians. That's fine. That's normal. That even probably the Israelites did that too. You see, the conservatives want to believe the Israelites were like wearing the whole garbs and stuff and were really rigid, and that's not the case. If you look at the stories, David is dancing around, and it's it's not like conservative rigidity. That's a liberal perspective, but the idea with the women is yeah, conservatives want women to be controlled and dominated and subjugated and to be dressed up completely. And that makes sense as a genetic Darwinian perspective. Control them in order for your race to be superior, and that's that focus on the ego, focus on perpetuating your race, and that's a conservative mentality. But it's also this idea that women are it's driven by this idea that women are kind of a prejudicial idea that women need to be controlled because they're out of control and they're feeling oriented and they can't function without being dominated and that's a conservative where you try to impose qualities on people to justify subjugation and mistreatment. Now, again, a completely liberal person might say, yeah, we'll let women just have sex, whatever. If a woman does it, it's not that big of a deal. But the thing is, we do know that there is types of lifestyles that don't bring a lot of happiness, and that's a very self-confirmatory kind of self-indulgent lifestyle of being too promiscuous, and that can lead to negative consequences. We don't want to be judgmental of it, but the conservative, you see that the flow is not conservative because that's conformity and that's not the flow. But also the flow isn't being promiscuous and just doing whatever you want, being impulsive. But the flow is kind of a transcendental, seeking inquiry and being a beneficial presence in existence. Um, Not a judgmental or not judgmental person. And then the idea too is there's a lot of cultural capital that like black people don't, or people of color don't have a lot of the cultural capital. And Richard Feynman talked about how when black people were brought from Africa, black people lost their history. Like Asians, they have history. They have people to look back upon, and they have families back in Asia that and they to be proud of and stuff. But the black people were taken and they lost their history. They don't have any, and they're taken from tribal society, and then they have imposed upon them stereotypes uh, that are self fulfilling, because that justified their mistreatment. And it becomes a cycle because then black people still they never had the same cultural capital because it's generational. You know, even white people, Asians or whatever, they had cultural capital that they could hand over to their children. Black people got out of slavery; they had nothing. They didn't have anybody to help them in Africa. They didn't have anybody to help them anywhere. And so it's a different type of situation, and that's why you have to be sensitive to that situation. And and it's important to be able to take that in and understand the difficulties of pulling yourself up out of that. You can do it, but again, they don't have the same cultural capital. A white child, most of them are going to have books in their house when they grow up, and they're going to have, their parents know how to read. For a lot of the black people, they didn't have anything for generations coming out of slavery. So it's different types of situations, and you have to be susceptible and being able to discern that. And and there's different situations for the American Indians being colonized, and That's why it's important to not say like, okay, well, let's just completely let go of race, and we don't want to talk about race. We just want to talk about the content of people's character. Where you if you're really in the flow, if you're really discerning, then you're going to be able to recognize the different circumstances. And then like I want to talk about like the Medusa thing. It was interesting. This guy cut off. They had the statue of someone holding a Medusa holding a man's head. I think it was who's the guy that cut off Medusa's head? Let me look it up. I think it was Perseus. Yeah, Perseus cut off Medusa's head. And a lot of liberals will look at this and they'll say that it's patriarchal. And what it was about the patriarchal society dominating the matriarchal society and taking over, and that's what Perseus cutting off Medusa's head represented. Um, so a liberal is going to say, hey, so what happened with Medusa was she was raped, and then she ended up going off. She was a victim of rape, and then she went off into the whatever, and then into the fields, and then she had snakes grow on her hair, and then and she was like basically in a lot of pain and distress over the rape, and anybody who looked at her turned into stone, and then Perseus cuts off her head, and that was seen as a good thing. And it's the idea that maybe women deserve rape, maybe she wanted it, and she shouldn't have been complaining and whining. She just wanted attention. That's kind of the conservative mentality. But the liberal mentality, where is, hey, how about let's switch this up and have her cut off Perseus's head, and we should listen to women, and we should have respect for women, and not justify rape and not justify their mistreatment. So like you even saw it with the Trump supporters, like the women Trump supporters. You would see them talking like about some of the people who were accused of rape, like Weinstein or other people, and they were like, yeah, that was you can't really trust the women. You don't really know what really happened and stuff. So that's more the conservative idea, and yeah, the conservatives they look highly upon the group with power, and they blame the victims. That's their whole modus operandi, and so it's like, yeah, the women they kind of deserve it. We don't really know what happened, so it's kind of dismissive, but that's kind of judgmental toward the women. But then a liberal is going to say, hey, we should listen to her. Don't cut off her head. Listen to her. Now, a transpersonal perspective of this, what my grandpa teach probably is that maybe like Perseus represents the transpersonal consciousness, and Medusa, women tend to represent more the interpersonal, the physical consciousness, dualistic, and Perseus cutting off her head might represent breaking free of that interpersonal whining type of consciousness, and it is true, like Carl Jung said that some women do want to get raped, and like I know for myself, when I was complaining, whining, complaining, it could be self-indulgent about what happened to me. It could be self-indulgent, and it could not be helpful, and it's probably best to transcend that, and because it does, that type of mentality doesn't really accomplish too much beneficial stuff. But and when I did that, I was conservative at the time when I was doing all the complaining and stuff and posting all that stuff on Facebook and stuff, and I was confused. So yeah, it's best to move on beyond that. But to be judgmental about it and say, oh, let's not don't talk about the past, Medusa. Don't talk about the past. Quit complaining and bitching. Take responsibility. It was your fault. That's judgmental. So we don't have to do that. But what you can do is do what Perseus metaphorically did and cut off her head, which would be to break her free of ego consciousness. But we don't want to blame her and say, oh, it's because your ego consciousness. Oh, you're stupid. You're the problem, Medusa. That's the problem. That right there is the ego consciousness. So yeah, but Perseus, we don't want Perseus to get caught up in ego consciousness, which is that conservative, self preoccupation type of consciousness. The flow is when you lose yourself, yeah. But at the same time, let's not interpret this story as a victim blaming story. And oh yeah, she's the that's not the what that story is trying to elucidate. And And that's why that piece of artwork was made, where Medusa's holding the head instead, to kind of break people free of that type of interpretation and move them more toward a transpersonal interpretation, which I'll call it like transpersonal liberal. But transpersonal is even beyond liberal. But it's definitely not conservative or unhealthy conservative. And another interesting phenomenon that I noticed is people will blame the victim so much that like they'll say, "Oh yeah, Hitler. Did you know that Hitler was actually black? He had like sub-Saharan hair in Africa. He was actually Jewish. Like he had a." And then so again, it's like that victim blaming, and that would be a conservative like judgmental attitude. It's not our fault. It's their fault. They're the bad guys. The fact of the matter was Hitler didn't do that much. It was mainly Nazi people, and there was other commanders doing most of the work. And Hitler's kind of used as the scapegoat, but he wasn't really doing that much, to be honest. He gave some big speeches, but he wasn't in charge of that much. So it kind of gets annoying when people just Hitler, cut it with that. It wasn't that. And then again, a liberal mentality though would be, okay, why did the Germans do this? There's that one experiment that they did where they would press the buttons. I think it's called the Milgram experiment, where they would if you have somebody telling you to do something like press buttons to zap somebody, people just do it. So that's one way, and you could say, okay, Germans aren't inherently bad. Somebody could say, oh yeah, Germans are just, like a liberal could even say Germans are really just evil white people. That could be one way of looking at it. But a more transpersonal way of looking at it, like they're just rigid. They're all about work, and because that's the nature of people from the north. They're all rigid and about work, and also they're homogenous ethnically, and that makes them want to destroy anybody who's not in their group, and that's why white people are Nazis. That would be that would be a liberal way of looking at it, but that would be kind of an unhealthy liberal way of looking at it, looking down upon the white people. And that again is looking at the people's nature and not looking at the environment. And in that sense, it can be conservative, and it continues, it perpetuates that that stereotypical mentality where we're not looking at people as individuals and we're lumping together in a group. So one way of looking at it would be that Milgram experiment, that they were just conforming. Another way of looking at it would be that they were in an economic crisis, and they were uneducated, and they did they were at that time period they didn't have access to higher levels of teachings, and so there's different ideas of why it happened. But one thing I was pointing out was you'll find some conservative people, oh yeah, well Hitler was actually Jewish, or Hitler was actually black, and again that's that victim blaming mentality, or where it's judgmental, and like Candace Owens is like, I think that people should be allowed to protect their country and protect their group and everything. That's that conservative mentality, where she's become kind of a white supremacist. She was a Trump supporter and a victim blamer, where she's like, oh, it's just because they're lazy, they have the victim mentality. They don't work hard. But she's rich because she got lucky and she was an actress or something. And then so she thinks I deserve it, I'm better, and so she's adopted that type of. And she's also just uneducated, and I feel bad for her because she's been brainwashed, and she also has a white husband, and she might feel bad for him. She wants to belong with the white people and the conservatives, but the stuff gets complex. But you also saw the same thing with Craig Cobb, where Craig Cobb was he was a white supremacist, and he had the genetic testing, and they're like, oh, you're like 17% sub-Saharan Africa. He's like, whoa. Really, there's like statistical anomalies with these things, but again, people could use that, and they'll be judgmental and be like, oh yeah, well no wonder he's so gangster and stuff because he's black. And then even you saw Craig Cobb falling into the stereotypes afterwards. He was walking around that Lehigh place or wherever he was living, the white supremacist place, and he was holding a gun, and he's like, you could tell by he was walking, he was like trying to walk like he was like a gangster, and maybe it was like a stereotype effect where he was like, yeah, I am black, and he's trying to like act like a black guy. And he's trying to see that's a conservative mentality. A conservative black person will follow the stereotypes that he's been given to maintain the order. That's what conservatives do. They believe the order. They believe that they have the fixed mentality. They believe the stereotypes, and they follow through. And most people are conservative, especially SJs in this orientation. But everybody has that tendency. We all have the same functional tendencies. So maybe even like Craig Cobb is like, yeah, and he's trying to be like that. And then in so doing, he's actually trying to perpetuate the, oh yeah, blacks are gangsters and they're dumb and stuff by him acting like a thug and all dualistic and stuff. But again, it's that victim blaming mentality where they'll be like, oh, well, no wonder why he's so, he's so crazy because he's, or such a gangster or whatever. It's just like, so that's what conservatives do. They victim blame and they look at superficial qualities. They don't look at people's individuals. They look at groups. So that's about it that I want to talk about.